Grace had always been the first person to enter the tall glass building every morning. Even before the lights came on, she moved quietly through the halls with her cleaning cart, pushing it slowly while the whole office was still asleep. Every morning felt the same, but she never complained. She believed work done with honesty always mattered, even if no one noticed it. She was a black woman in her late 40s with warm eyes, tired hands, and a heart that still carried hope, even though her job title was custodian. She treated the building like it was her own home, making sure everything was clean and ready before the busy day started. But the sad truth was that almost no one in the office knew her name. People walked past her without looking, they talked around her, dropped trash near her cart, sometimes even left messes for her to clean up without saying thank you. New employees thought she was just another part of the background, like the chairs or the windows. Grace noticed everything but said nothing. She had learned long ago that staying calm was sometimes the only way to move forward. Still, the way people ignored her sometimes made her wonder how invisible a person could become in a building full of people. Even though she did not receive attention, she knew more about the office than anyone else. She knew who arrived early, who argued in the meeting rooms, who cried in the bathrooms, who stayed late to finish work. She saw the truth of people, not the version they tried to show. Grace had a quiet wisdom that came from years of watching life happen in front of her without being part of it, yet she never used what she knew to hurt others. She simply cleaned, listened, and continued her day with a soft smile that no one cared to see. Every morning, she would stop by the receptionist's desk and leave a small chocolate there. The receptionist never asked who kept doing it. She just enjoyed the little treat and told others it must be some nice person. Grace only smiled to herself when she heard it. She liked bringing small kindness to people even when they didn't know where it came from. Maybe she felt it was the only way she could still matter, even if from a distance. Grace's uniform was old but always spotless. Her shoes were clean, her hair tied neatly, her badge always shining even though no one bothered to read it. Sometimes she wondered if she should try to talk to people more, but years of being ignored had taught her that silence was easier. The building felt like her second home, yet she felt like a guest no one invited. She wanted to be respected, not praised, just respected like any other human who worked hard. On this particular morning, the office was extra busy because the CEO had called an important board meeting. People were rushing in earlier than usual, stressed and loud. Papers were scattered everywhere, coffee cups appeared in strange places, and the energy in the building felt different. Grace worked faster than normal, wanting to make sure everything was perfect before the big meeting started. She wiped tables, polished the floors, fixed chairs, and made sure the boardroom looked spotless. She did all of this without being asked, without expecting anything in return. As she cleaned the long table in the boardroom, one of the executives walked in. He didn't say good morning, didn't smile, didn't even slow down. He just stepped around her and started checking his phone. Grace stepped aside, letting him pass. She had grown used to people treating her as if she wasn't there, but deep inside, she still wished someone would simply look up and say, "Good morning, Grace." She had heard her name spoken kindly only a few times in this building, and each time felt like a warm light on her soul. Despite being overlooked, Grace carried a strength no one could see. She had survived losses in her life, worked multiple jobs, raised children on her own, and still showed up every day with quiet dignity. But the people in fancy suits never imagined she had a story. They thought she was just a custodian who knew nothing beyond sweeping and wiping. They never knew about her past, her intelligence, or her pain. But Grace knew something they didn't. She knew that respect was not something people gave easily, especially to someone like her. She also knew that pride did not come from job titles but from the way a person carried their heart. As the sun rose higher, workers filled the hallways, laughing, complaining, living their lives. Grace kept moving from room to room, unnoticed like a shadow, yet she was the one who made their day smoother without them realizing it. If she didn't show up for even one morning, the whole building would feel different. But still, no one thanked her, not even once that day. Grace paused for a moment in a quiet hallway, leaning on her cart. She looked around the office she had cared for so long. She wondered if anyone would ever see her for who she truly was, not just for the job she did. She did not know that her life was about to change, that the same building where people ignored her would soon echo with gasps and whispers because of something she would do. Something no one expected from the woman everyone overlooked, but for now, she took a deep breath. straightened her uniform, and continued her work, unaware that the biggest moment of her life was waiting just around the corner. Richard Hale walked into the building like he owned the air people breathed. His steps were loud, sharp, and full of confidence that came from years of being treated like the most important man in every room. He was tall, always dressed in expensive suits, and never smiled unless the cameras were on him. Most employees feared him more than they respected him. To them, he was the kind of CEO who remembered profits but forgot people. He believed that success meant power, and power meant control. Anyone beneath him was simply part of the background, existing to make his life easier. Richard loved arriving early on meeting days, not because he wanted to prepare but because he enjoyed watching others scramble to impress him. He liked the feeling of walking past employees who would fix their posture or lower their eyes. That morning, he held his coffee in one hand and a folder in the other, already annoyed by a small stain he noticed on his shoes. It wasn't even big, just a tiny mark near the heel, but to him, any flaw was unacceptable. In his mind, leaders had to look perfect, even if their hearts were far from it. As he moved through the hallway, he saw Grace near the elevators, quietly polishing a metal surface. She didn't see him at first. She was focused on her work, moving the cloth in small, gentle circles. Richard slowed his steps, narrowing his eyes at her. He had seen her 100 times but never really looked at her. To him, she was just the custodian, someone who blended into the environment like the plants or the wall clocks. He noticed her calm expression, the way she worked with care, and for a moment, he felt something strange, irritation. Maybe it bothered him that she seemed so peaceful while he felt so stressed. He cleared his throat loudly, making sure she heard him. Grace turned quickly, offering the polite smile she always used. "Good morning, sir," she said softly, but Richard didn't reply. He only looked at the stain again, then at her, as if the universe had placed her there for his convenience. He leaned slightly and pointed at his shoe. "You," he said sharply, "clean this." His voice cut through the hallway like a blade. Grace blinked, confused. "Sir," she asked gently, thinking she heard wrong. Richard stepped closer, lifting his foot slightly. "I said clean my shoes," he repeated, louder this time. His tone was not a request. It was a command, one he believed she would follow without question. A few employees walking by slowed their steps, pretending not to stare but secretly watching. No one dared to interfere. Everyone knew Richard's temper. Grace looked at him, her hands still holding the cleaning cloth. Her heart beat a little faster. She had cleaned many things in the building, but she had never been told to shine someone's shoes like she was a servant. Still, her voice remained steady. I am sorry, sir," she said, "but that is not my job." Richard's eyebrows shot up, shock flashed across his face, followed quickly by anger. "Excuse me," he said, as if she had spoken a foreign language. He couldn't believe she had refused him. In his world, custodians did not challenge CEOs, they obeyed, always. The employees watching held their breath. Some even stepped back, afraid of what would happen next. Grace stood still, her eyes calm. She wasn't trying to challenge him, she was simply trying to defend her dignity, but Richard didn't see it that way. To him, her refusal was disrespect. "Do you know who I am?" he asked harshly, leaning closer. Grace nodded politely. "Yes, sir, you are the CEO," she said with quiet honesty, "and I respect that, but I am not hired to clean shoes." For a moment, Richard couldn't speak. He felt his pride burning inside him. How dare she talk back, especially in front of others? His face tightened, and the hallway felt suddenly tense. Everyone expected him to explode. He pointed at her again, his voice low but sharp. "You think you can refuse me?" he asked, his words filled with disbelief. But Grace didn't step back, didn't lower her eyes, didn't tremble like others usually did around him. She stood with a gentle firmness, something Richard had never seen from her before. That small act, just standing her ground, angered him more than anything. In that moment, Grace, the custodian he had always overlooked, had made him feel powerless, and Richard Hale hated feeling powerless. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this small refusal in a quiet hallway, would soon become the most talked about incident in the entire building. It would travel from desk to desk, office to office, until it reached the ears of the board itself, and what happened next would not only shock the CEO but shake the whole company from the inside. Grace had taken her first step into a storm she never asked for, but one she was strong enough to face. The morning sun had barely settled over the city when word began to move quietly through the building. It started with 2 employees whispering near the break room, then another group near the conference hall picked it up. Soon, almost everyone on the 3rd floor had heard some version of the same story. The custodian refused the CEO. People repeated it in different tones, shocked, amused, impressed, but mostly afraid. No one had ever said no to Richard Hale, not even the top executives. To imagine a quiet custodian doing it felt unreal. Grace didn't know people were talking. She simply continued her work like she always did, wiping glass, arranging chairs, checking the trash bins. She didn't raise her voice, didn't defend herself, didn't complain to anyone. She only carried a small worry inside her chest, wondering if she had made a mistake. She hadn't meant to disrespect the CEO, she only wanted to protect her dignity. But dignity often costs too much in places run by pride. While Grace worked quietly, Richard Hale stormed into his office. His jaw was tight, and his steps were sharp enough to echo. He slammed the door behind him, making his assistant jump. He threw the folder onto his desk and paced the room in anger. The refusal replayed in his mind again and again. The calm tone, the steady eyes, the lack of fear. It felt like someone had stabbed a hole in his authority, and he didn't know how to stop the wound from bleeding. He picked up his phone, ready to call security and get Grace removed from the building, but he paused. Something didn't feel right. Firing her over a shoe incident would look strange. People might question him, and Richard hated being questioned. He needed a smarter way to regain control without exposing his own cruelty. His chance arrived sooner than he expected. At exactly 9 in the morning, the board members began arriving for the important meeting he had called. They walked past him with polite greetings, unaware that his pride was already cracked. Richard forced himself to smile, adjusting his suit, trying to hide the storm inside him. Today was supposed to be his day to present a major company project. But his mind kept returning to the custodian with the soft voice who had said no. As Grace pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway near the boardroom, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and found the Vice President of Finance, Mrs. Lillian Brooks, standing there with a warm smile. Lillian was one of the rare people who treated everyone kindly, including Grace. "Good morning, Grace," she said softly. Grace smiled back, grateful for a familiar kindness. "Good morning, ma'am," she replied. Lillian leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Is it true? Did you really refuse Mr. Hale this morning?" Grace felt her heart drop. She hadn't wanted anyone to know. She nodded slowly. "I didn't mean to upset him," she said. "I just wanted to do my job, not something I wasn't hired for." Lillian's smile didn't fade. Instead it grew thoughtful. "You did nothing wrong," she said gently. "No one should treat you like that." But Grace still worried. "Will I get in trouble?" she asked quietly. Before Lillian could answer, the door to the boardroom opened, and Richard Hale himself stepped out. His eyes landed on Grace immediately. The hallway froze. A few board members who were inside the room turned to look. Curious, Grace instinctively straightened her back, gripping the handle of her cart. Her heart beat hard against her ribs. Richard's voice came out cold. "You," he said, pointing at her just like before, "come inside." Grace's breath caught. She didn't know why he wanted her in the boardroom. Lillian touched her arm gently, as if giving silent support. Grace stepped forward slowly, pushing her cart aside. Richard held the door open, his jaw tight, trying to maintain his authority. She walked inside the large room, feeling small under the bright lights and long table surrounded by powerful faces. The boardroom smelled like polished wood and expensive perfume. Grace had cleaned this room many times, but she had never been inside during an actual meeting. The chairs were filled with men and women in suits, most of whom looked at her with surprise. A few leaned forward, curious to see what was happening. Richard closed the door behind her. "Tell them," he said sharply, "tell them what you said to me this morning." His tone was daring her to lie, daring her to tremble. The board members watched with wide eyes. Grace took a slow breath. She looked around the table, then looked at Richard. Then, in the calmest voice she had ever used in her life, she spoke. "I told him I am not hired to clean shoes," she said softly. "I only do the work I am paid for. With respect." A quiet gasp moved through the room, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, clear, steady, and without fear. One board member whispered to another, another raised an eyebrow. Lillian stepped into the room behind her, adding a silent witness to the moment. Richard folded his arms, waiting for the board to side with him. but the people in the room didn't look angry, they looked thoughtful, even impressed, and in that small shift of expression, Grace unknowingly changed the balance of power. Richard felt it too, and his heart tightened in panic. He hadn't brought Grace inside to embarrass himself, but that was exactly what had begun to happen, and the next word spoken in that room would soon turn the entire situation upside down, sending shockwaves through the company that no one saw coming. The boardroom was so quiet that Grace could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner. She stood near the wall, her hands folded gently in front of her. Richard stood across from her with a stiff posture, his jaw locked tight. The board members looked from him to her, waiting, studying, trying to understand what kind of situation they had just stepped into. None of them had expected to start their important meeting with a custodian in the room, but something about Grace's calmness kept their eyes fixed on her. Richard cleared his throat sharply. "You see what I'm dealing with?" he said, trying to sound insulted. "An employee who refuses a simple request," but there was a bitterness in his voice, like he was trying too hard. The board members did not react the way he expected. One of them, Mr. Collins, an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, leaned back in his chair. "A simple request," he repeated slowly, "or something inappropriate for her job description?" His tone was careful, but his meaning was clear. Richard felt his face heat. He hadn't expected anyone to question him. "She's a custodian," he snapped. "Cleaning is her job." Grace looked down for a moment, not out of fear but to gather strength. Then she lifted her head and spoke softly. "Cleaning the building, yes," she said, "but not cleaning personal shoes." Her words were gentle, but they carried more weight than a shout. The boardroom seemed to grow even quieter as her voice settled into the space between them. Mrs. Daniels, a woman known for her precision and fairness, tilted her head. "Is that true, Mr. Hale?" she asked calmly. "Did you ask her to clean your shoes?" Richard opened his mouth, ready to defend himself, but the way she asked the question made it feel like a trap. He could either deny it and be caught lying, or admit it and look foolish. His pride tightened around him like a rope. It was a small thing, he argued. She could have done it in seconds. Grace's heart beat slowly, steady like a drum. She wasn't trying to humiliate him, she only wanted the truth to remain clear. "Respect is also a small thing, sir," she said quietly, and just like that, the entire room shifted. Her words struck something inside the board members. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it held honesty, and honesty has a way of cutting deeper than anger. Mrs. Daniels nodded slowly. "She is right," she murmured. Mr. Collins tapped his pen on the table thoughtfully. "Mr. Hale," he said, "why exactly did you make that request?" Richard felt his breath catch for a moment. He wasn't used to being questioned, not by the board and certainly not in front of someone he considered beneath him. "It was a busy morning," he said tightly. "I needed things handled quickly. I didn't mean anything by it." But the board members saw through him. They weren't fools. They had watched his behavior for years, seen his arrogance, his impatience, his coldness toward employees. Some had complained privately but never said it out loud. Now, because of a custodian with gentle eyes, the truth was being dragged into the light. Grace looked around the room, feeling their eyes on her. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. She clenched her fingers together lightly, trying to keep her nerves steady. She didn't want trouble for anyone, not even the CEO who had spoken harshly to her. She simply wanted fairness. She took a slow breath and said softly, "I have always done my job with respect. I don't want conflict. I only want to be treated like a person, not an object." Her words hit the hearts of everyone in the room. The simplicity and softness made them even more powerful. Lillian, standing near the doorway, stepped forward slightly and nodded in agreement. "Grace has never caused trouble," she said. "She is one of the most respectful workers in this building." Hearing that from a high-level executive made the board members' expressions grow even more serious. Richard felt his control slipping away. It was like sand falling through his fingers. His voice tightened. "Are we really wasting time on this?" he snapped. "We have an important agenda today," but his attempt to redirect the conversation only made him look defensive. The board members exchanged glances. Their eyes asked silent questions. If he couldn't treat the lowest employee with basic respect, what did that say about his leadership? Mr. Collins leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Mr. Hale," he said slowly, "respect is not a waste of time, it is the foundation of a healthy workplace." Richard felt embarrassment burn his throat. He wanted to blame Grace, but he knew the room wasn't on his side anymore. Grace looked down again, wishing she could step out quietly. She had never wanted to be in the middle of anything. She only wanted to sweep floors, wipe tables, and return home in peace, yet here she was, standing in a boardroom full of powerful people because she had chosen dignity over fear. Then something unexpected happened. Mr. Collins turned to her and said gently, "Grace, thank you for speaking honestly." No one had ever thanked her in this room before. His voice held real respect. Grace felt something warm rise inside her, like a small light that had been asleep for years and had finally opened its eyes. Richard clenched his jaw, feeling trapped by the truth he had created himself. He had brought Grace into this room to embarrass her, but now he was the one standing on shaky ground, and the next step the board would take, a step Richard could not predict, would turn the whole situation even more upside down, in a way no one in the room expected. The boardroom air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting for what would happen next. Grace stood quietly near the edge of the room, wishing she could disappear. She had never asked for attention, never asked to be noticed. She only wanted to work in peace, but now every eye in the room was on her, and she had no idea that something even bigger was about to come out, something she had kept hidden for years. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses and looked at her with genuine interest. "Grace," he said gently, "how long have you worked here?" Grace took a breath. 6 years, sir," she answered softly. "Since the year my husband passed away." A few board members exchanged a look of sympathy. Grace continued, her voice steady, "I took the job because I needed something stable, something I could manage while raising my children." Her words came out carefully, not seeking pity but simply telling the truth. Richard shifted uncomfortably. He had never cared to know anything about her life. To him, she had always been just a custodian, but now, in front of the board, her story made him feel smaller, weaker, as if he had misjudged someone without knowing anything about them. Mr. Collins nodded slowly. "You've been consistent, and from what I've heard, extremely reliable," he said. Mrs. Daniels added, "Always polite, always early, always professional." Grace lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the praise. She had never been praised in this room before. Lillian stepped forward. "If I may add something," she said carefully. The board members turned toward her. "Grace is more than a custodian," she said. "She once owned a small cleaning company. She had 12 employees, and she managed everything: schedules, clients, payments, supplies." A wave of surprise moved through the boardroom. Grace felt her heart flutter. She hadn't expected Lillian to share that part of her past. Mr. Collins raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "You ran a business?" he asked. Grace nodded shyly. "Yes, sir," she said, "for almost 8 years." "Then why are you here?" Mrs. Daniels asked gently. Grace hesitated, pain returning to her eyes. "My husband got sick," she said quietly. "Cancer. Very fast. We spent everything we had to save him. I let the business go. I took any job I could find." Her voice trembled slightly. "I needed to keep my children safe." The room went silent, the kind of silence that carried emotion, not judgment. Even the board members known for their blunt attitudes softened. Richard looked away, ashamed but trying to hide it. Before this moment, he had never imagined that the woman who cleaned the floors had once been a business owner, a leader, a person who had fought through real hardship. "And there is more," Lillian added. "Grace also has a degree, a bachelor's in business administration." Several board members blinked, shocked. Richard's jaw tightened so hard it almost hurt. He had humiliated a highly educated woman in the hallway, treating her like she was beneath him. Grace's hands trembled slightly. She had never meant for anyone to know. She had buried her accomplishments deep because life had forced her to start over from the bottom. Mrs. Daniels leaned forward, her voice softer than before. "Grace, why didn't you ever apply for any other position?" Grace looked at her hands. "Because no one ever asked," she said. "No one ever saw me. I didn't know if I still belonged in rooms like this." Her words entered the board members' hearts like a quiet truth they could not ignore. Mr. Collins exhaled slowly and turned toward Richard. "Mr. Hale," he said carefully, "did you know any of this?" Richard's eyes flickered. "No," he said, his voice thin. "How could I?" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but everyone in the room knew what he was about to say. "She's just a custodian." That unfinished thought was enough to make several board members exchange disapproving looks. Mrs. Daniels shook her head. "Titles do not determine worth," she said firmly, "and leadership does not come from power, it comes from respect." She looked at Grace kindly, "And this woman has shown more respect in 6 years than some leaders show in their whole career." Richard flinched at the unspoken message. He felt heat rise in his neck as embarrassment wrapped around him. Grace felt her eyes burning, not from humiliation but from something unexpected. Someone finally seeing her, someone finally speaking to her like a human being with a story, not a uniform. She took a quiet breath and said softly, "I never wanted trouble, sir. I only wanted to be treated fairly, that's all." For the first time, the board members saw her not as a silent worker but as a strong woman who had survived pain, responsibility, and loss while still carrying dignity in her heart. Richard swallowed hard, realizing how terribly he had judged someone he didn't understand at all. And just when the room thought the moment had reached its highest point, Mr. Collins leaned forward with a thoughtful expression. His next words would begin a radical shift in the company, and would turn Richard's world upside down even more. He looked at Grace and said, "Grace, would you be willing to share your ideas about how this company can improve?" With that single question, Grace stepped into a role she never expected, and the entire board leaned in to listen. Grace felt her breath catch when Mr. Collins asked her to share her ideas. She had cleaned this room for years, always from the outside, always unnoticed. She never imagined she would one day stand inside it, being asked to speak, not as a custodian but as a thinker, a person with value. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she even belonged in a conversation with people who made decisions worth millions. But then she remembered her late husband's words, "You're stronger than you think, Grace," he used to say. She took a slow breath and lifted her eyes. "If you really want to know," she said softly, "I do have some ideas." The board members leaned in, not out of politeness but genuine interest. Richard, on the other hand, tensed in his chair. This was not what he wanted. He had brought her into this room to embarrass her, not to watch her get attention and respect. He sat stiffly, his arms crossed, his eyes sharp with frustration, but the board no longer looked at him. Their attention had shifted completely to Grace, and that shift wounded his pride more than anything else that morning. Grace stepped slightly closer to the table, her hands clasped in front of her. "I see everything in this building," she began gently. "Maybe because people don't notice me, they talk freely around me, they drop things, they forget things, they argue in front of me." She paused, "But I don't hold any of that against them, I only observe, and I've noticed patterns." Mrs. Daniels encouraged her with a nod. "Go on, Grace." Grace continued, "I've seen employees crying in bathrooms because of pressure, I've seen workers stay late because they're scared to leave early, I've seen people avoid talking to managers because they feel judged." She glanced at Richard for a second, then looked away quickly. "This company is strong," she said, "but inside, a lot of people are hurting quietly." The board members exchanged looks of surprise. They knew the numbers, the profits, the charts, but not the human side of the office. Grace was giving them something they never saw, the truth from the ground level. Mr. Collins leaned forward. "And what do you think would help improve things?" he asked gently. Grace took another slow breath. "People need to feel respected," she said, "no matter their job title. When people feel valued, they work better, they trust leaders more. Small things matter, a greeting, a thank you, a chance to share ideas. Some workers know solutions to problems, but no one ever asks them." She paused and added softly, "Like no one ever asked me." Her voice was not bitter, it was honest, and honesty filled the room like a soft light that made everyone see more clearly. Mrs. Daniels nodded thoughtfully. "She's right," she said, "we've focused on productivity, not people." Another board member murmured, "This is the kind of insight we've been missing." Richard clenched his jaw, unable to hide his irritation. He felt the room slipping away from his control. "This is unnecessary," he snapped suddenly. "She's a custodian, not an advisor." His words cut sharply through the air. But this time, no one nodded in agreement. Instead, several board members looked at him with disappointment. Mr. Collins spoke calmly. "Mr. Hale, leadership means listening, especially to those who see what we cannot." Mrs. Daniels added quietly, "And sometimes wisdom comes from unexpected places." Richard felt cornered, his pride was bruised, and anger pulsed behind his ribs. He didn't want Grace to have a voice in this room, he didn't want her to influence the board's opinion, but nothing he said could stop the shift already happening. Grace stepped back slightly, not wanting conflict, "I'm sorry if I spoke too much," she said softly. "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone." Lillian shook her head firmly. "You disrespected no one, Grace," she said. "You spoke with honesty and courage." One of the older board members, a quiet man who rarely spoke, finally lifted his eyes. "I want to point something out," he said slowly. "Mr. Hale showed us this morning how he treats people he thinks are lower than him." He gestured to Grace, "and she showed us how to treat people with dignity no matter what." His words struck the room like a gentle but undeniable truth. Richard's face turned pale. His authority had cracked in front of the people who control the company's future. He tried to regain control. "Are we seriously considering taking advice from?" He stopped because the looks he received were cold, warning him not to cross a line. "Mrs. Daniels turned back to Grace. "Would you be willing to help us design a new workplace behavior program?" she asked. The question shocked everyone, including Grace herself. Grace blinked, confused. "Me?" she whispered. "I don't know if I can do something like that." "You can, Mr. Collins said gently. "You've already started today." Grace felt her eyes warm with emotion she hadn't expected to feel. She had walked into the building that morning thinking she was no one, invisible, just doing her job, and now she was being asked to help change the company. Richard sat frozen, stunned, furious, and deeply threatened. He had tried to humiliate her, but instead, he had accidentally given her a voice, and the board had listened. The real consequences were only beginning, and the next part of this story would shake Richard's position more than he ever imagined. Richard Hale sat in his chair like a man trapped in a tightening cage. He could feel the board's attention drifting away from him and settling around Grace like a protective circle. Every word they spoke to her felt like another crack forming in his authority. The company had always moved according to his voice. But this time, the room answered to someone else, someone he thought was powerless, someone he had tried to humiliate. Grace stood quietly, unsure how she had arrived at this moment. She didn't want trouble, she didn't want revenge, she only wanted fairness. Her hands trembled slightly as she held them together. She felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her, but unlike before, the looks were not dismissive, they were curious, respectful, even hopeful. Mrs. Daniels exchanged a glance with Mr. Collins before speaking again. "Grace," she said, "your understanding of this workplace is valuable. You see things none of us do." Mr. Collins nodded. "I think we should consider her for a more formal position," he said, "something in employee relations or workplace culture." Richard's head snapped up, his voice burst out without control. "What? You cannot be serious." His words were sharp, slicing through the room. The board turned to him with mixed expressions, disappointment, irritation, even mild disgust. He had pushed them too far. Mrs. Daniels responded calmly. "We are very serious," she said. "Your reaction alone proves why this conversation is necessary." Richard's face reddened. He tried to maintain his composure. "She is not qualified," he insisted. "She cleans floors." Grace lowered her eyes, as if his words had slapped her. But Mr. Collins didn't let the insult pass. "She ran a business," he reminded. "She has a degree, she manages stressful tasks every day with calmness that you, Mr. Hale, sometimes fail to show." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Richard felt heat rise behind his ears. Being compared to a custodian, and losing, was a humiliation he couldn't process. "I won't allow this," Richard snapped. "This is absurd. You're letting a moment of emotion ruin good judgment." His voice shook, not with strength, but desperation. "If we start giving positions based on sympathy." "Enough," Mrs. Daniels said sharply, surprising even herself. Her voice echoed through the room, stopping Richard mid-sentence. "This is not about sympathy, this is about behavior, respect, and leadership." She looked directly into his eyes. "Things you have been neglecting for a long time." Richard's jaw tightened, his world was spinning out of his control. His position suddenly felt like sand slipping between his fingers. He tried to speak again, but Mr. Collins raised a hand, silencing him. "We've watched you for years," he said. "We've ignored your arrogance because the company made money, but money does not excuse mistreatment." Grace felt her heart clench. She had never wanted to be the cause of anyone's downfall. She stepped forward gently. "Please," she said softly, "I don't want anyone to get in trouble because of me." Her voice shook with sincerity. "I only wanted to do my job, and be treated nicely, that's all." Her gentleness struck the board deeply. It showed she wasn't seeking power, revenge, or recognition. She simply wanted respect. something every worker deserved. Her humility made the board see her even more clearly, like a quiet light in the middle of a storm. One of the board members, a calm and thoughtful man named Mr. Alvarez, spoke for the first time. "Grace," he said kindly, "your strength is exactly what this workplace needs, someone who understands real people, not just numbers." He looked at the others. "I propose we offer her a leadership support position immediately, starting with an advisory role." Richard slammed his hand against the table. "You cannot make decisions without me," he barked. "I am the CEO." But the board did not flinch. Mr. Collins turned to him with an expression Richard had never seen before. "Authority, you are the CEO," he agreed, "but you are not above the board, and today, your behavior has forced us to re-evaluate your leadership." The word struck Richard like a punch. His control, his pride, his reputation, all began to crumble. "You're re-evaluating me?" he whispered, unable to hide the fear in his voice. No one answered immediately, and silence hit him harder than any words could. Grace looked between them, not sure what to do. Her heart ached with confusion and worry. She didn't want to ruin anyone's life. Richard had hurt her ego, but she had no desire to destroy his career. Still, the board had seen enough, and nothing she said now could undo what Richard had done to himself. Mrs. Daniels took a slow breath. "For now," she said, "we will begin an internal review of your conduct." "Mr. Hale," Richard's shoulders sank. He looked smaller than he had ever looked in his own boardroom. His voice came out quiet and desperate. "All because of her?" he said, staring at Grace with disbelief. "No, Mr. Collins said firmly, because of you." Grace's world tilted. She hadn't expected this, she hadn't sought this, but the truth had finally been spoken out loud, and it had consequences Richard could no longer escape. And the story wasn't finished yet, because what happened next would change both of their lives forever, in a way that would shock the whole board even more. Grace stepped out of the boardroom slowly, her heart beating like a drum against her ribs. The hallway felt brighter than before, louder, fuller. People had gathered in small groups, whispering about what had happened inside that room. Some stared with curiosity, others with respect. Grace felt her legs tremble slightly. She had never wanted attention, but now it followed her like a shadow. Lillian walked beside her, offering gentle support. "You handled yourself beautifully," she said softly. Grace lowered her eyes. "I didn't mean for any of that to happen," she whispered. "I only wanted to protect my dignity." Lillian smiled. "And you did. You changed more today than you realize." In the boardroom behind them, Richard Hale sat alone, staring at the polished table that had once felt like his throne. His reflection on the glossy surface looked unfamiliar, smaller, weaker, confused. The words, "internal review," echoed in his head. He had never imagined that a custodian, a woman he barely noticed, could be the reason his position shook, but it wasn't really because of Grace. It was because of the man he had allowed himself to become. Two board members remained inside, speaking in low voices. "He won't survive this," one said. "The investors won't ignore it," another replied. "We need leadership that respects people at every level." Their decision was nearly set, and Richard knew it. He felt fear for the first time in years. Not fear of losing money, but fear of facing the consequences of his arrogance. Meanwhile, Grace went back to the custodial room. She sat on the small wooden chair where she usually ate her lunch alone. Her hands shook as she rested them on her lap. She thought of her husband, her children, her struggles. She thought of the years she had felt invisible in the very building she cleaned. She thought of the boardroom where she had spoken with courage she never knew she had. Soft tears rolled down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from relief, from finally being seen as a human being, not just a uniform. Minutes later, there was a knock at her door. Grace wiped her tears quickly, expecting maybe Lillian or the receptionist, but when she opened the door, she froze. Standing there was Mr. Collins with two other board members. Their expressions were warm and respectful. "Grace," Mr. Collins said gently, "may we come in for a moment?" She nodded quickly and stepped aside, feeling her heart pound again. They sat on the small chairs, looking almost too big for the tiny room. Mrs. Daniels spoke first. "We've made a decision," she said with a kind smile. "We want to offer you a new position." Grace blinked, stunned. "A new position," she repeated softly. Mr. Collins nodded. Yes, he said, we want you to become the employee relations coordinator, someone who helps guide workplace culture, someone employees can talk to, someone who understands real struggles. Grace felt the room spin slowly. Me? She whispered, are you sure you want me? We don't just want you, Mrs. Daniels said, we need you. Grace covered her mouth with her hand, tears rising again, but this time heavier. She had gone from being unseen to being needed. It felt unreal. But what about my job? She asked softly, what about my cleaning duties? Mr. Collins smiled, you won't be doing custodial work anymore, Grace, he said kindly, you'll be part of management. She shook her head slowly, unable to find words strong enough for what she felt. Then Mrs. Daniels added gently, and don't worry about training, we'll help you through every step. Grace breathed deeply, overwhelmed by the kindness in their voices. The position they offered wasn't just a promotion. It was dignity, respect, a fresh beginning she never thought possible. Her husband would have been proud, she thought silently. He always believed she had a bigger purpose than sweeping floors. Before they left, Mr. Collins added one more thing. We will also conduct a full leadership review on Mr. Hale, he said. The board needs to decide what is best for the company. Grace nodded slowly, not wanting revenge, only fairness. I hope he learns from this, she said softly. I don't want him to suffer, I just want him to treat people better. Her gentleness stunned them. It reminded them why she was the right person for the new role. Later that afternoon, Grace walked through the halls not with her cart but with a quiet confidence she had never felt before. Employees who normally walked past her without noticing now looked at her with admiration and gratitude. Some smiled, some nodded, some whispered her name respectfully. Grace didn't know how to react, she simply smiled back each time, her heart warm with something new, belonging. Meanwhile, in his office, Richard sat with his head in his hands, realizing that the company he had controlled for years was slipping from his grasp. His downfall had not come from a competitor or a financial crisis, but from his own behavior, and the woman he had disrespected had become the mirror that showed him the truth. For the first time, he understood that power without kindness was nothing. As the sun set, the board sent out an announcement. Grace had been promoted, and Richard would temporarily step back during the investigation. The news spread like wildfire through the building. Some cheered quietly, others cried, a few even approached Grace to thank her for being brave enough to stand up for what was right. Grace walked home that evening feeling lighter, taller, stronger. She had stepped into the day as a custodian, invisible and overlooked, and she was leaving it as a leader, respected, valued, and seen. Sometimes life changes not with noise but with courage spoken softly in a room where no one expected you to speak at all. And the whole board, the entire company, would never look at her the same way again.